After I donated my kidney to save my boyfriend, he cheated with a girl from the recovery ward, called me the donor girl, and said it was just organs, not. I sent receipts to her parents and uploaded his begging voicemail to his church's. Paige, the nurse, was the one who told me. She looked so uncomfortable that I thought someone had died. In a way, someone had the version of me who believed in him. I was sitting in the post-op waiting area, still weak, still stitched, when I overheard his voice. It was muffled, familiar, and way too close. He was in the next room, laughing, flirting with another patient. The girl who'd had her appendix out 2 days before. Her laugh was soft and fake, the kind that girls do when they want attention. And then I heard it, his words, the same ones he'd whispered to me before the surgery. "You gave me new life, but I gotta live it my way, you know?" I froze. The IV in my arm burned cold. I waited for the punchline, for him to say he was joking. But then she giggled and said, "So I'm part of your new life." And he said, "You're the first good thing to happen since I got my new kidney." My kidney. 3 weeks earlier, I was his girlfriend of 2 years. The one who sat through every hospital visit, who slept on plastic chairs, who filled out donor paperwork because I couldn't stand the thought of losing him. Now, I was the girl in recovery with a missing organ and a missing boyfriend. When I finally confronted him, he didn't even look ashamed. He smirked, shrugged, and said the words that split me open worse than any surgical scar. It was just organs, not love. The girl he'd met at the ward, her name was Kayla, called me the donor girl to my face. She told me I should feel proud that my kidney was helping him live his best life. That night, I sat in my apartment with the hospital paperwork, the medical bills, and a voicemail from before the surgery, him crying, begging, promising he'd owe me everything. And that's when the idea hit me. Not revenge, not yet. Just the first step toward something he wouldn't recover from this time. Because if he thought getting my kidney was a new life, I was about to show him what dying by humiliation felt like. We met in Portland, in the kind of bar that smelled like smoked meat and cheap beer, southeast by the river. He was the guy who leaned against the pool table like he owned the room, grinning like it was a private joke. I was there with friends, nursing a beer and trying not to get pulled into someone else's conversation. He slid in beside me and asked if I knew how to play 8-ball. I lied and said yes. That's the stupid kind of lie that, for me, has historically led to the best things. His name was Mark. He had a laugh that made people lean in, like it was safe to tell him anything. He was bright, messy, magnetic, broke, but with this confidence that could make you believe a bad idea would pay off. He made me feel young even when I was tired. We dated, fast and furious. Cheap concerts, thrift store furniture, ramen nights at my tiny kitchen table. He called me my good luck and kissed me like the world might end if he stopped. After a year living together in a cramped Northeast apartment, Mark got sick. It started with fatigue and nights he'd wake up gasping. He brushed it off until the ER told him his kidneys were failing. He had been too proud to see the doctor earlier, too stubborn to listen. We learned he'd been born with a congenital issue, something that could have been flagged as a kid but wasn't. He went from being that brilliant mess to a person whose days revolved around dialysis schedules and lab results. I watched him shrink into appointments and IV poles. Friends started dropping off casseroles. His mother came up from Eugene and moved into the spare room. He joked to keep from crying. I read everything about transplants, about living donors and the logistics, and I kept thinking, I could do this. It wasn't heroic in my head, it was math. We matched blood types, the tests came back okay, and the doctor said it was possible. I remember signing paperwork with the same hand that later signed checks for our landlord. The day before the surgery, he cried in my car and begged me to back out, like he couldn't bear the idea of me losing a kidney. He said, "I'll fix this, we'll get through it." I told him it wasn't his job to fix me, that I loved him, and we'd be selfish together. I told myself the surgery was a blunt instrument of love. Pay a physical cost to buy him more days. The transplant was messy and miraculous. I woke up in a recovery room still dizzy and high on pain meds, but there was a warmth in my chest knowing I'd done it. For weeks, he was fragile and grateful. There were thank you dinners, and his friends toasted me like I'd led us out of some apocalypse. He sent me a shaky voicemail after the operation, sobbing, begging me never to doubt him, promising a life of repayment that sounded like devotion. I believed him. What I didn't see, because I wanted to believe, were the tiny shifts. The way he started staying late at work and didn't tell me why, the new smile when his phone buzzed across the couch, the way he started making plans that didn't include my name. I told myself stress made him distant. I chalked secrecy up to shame about being the sick one. I looked at hospital bills, at lab results, at my own incision, and told myself love is messy and survival is messier. The line between devotion and possession blurred after the surgery. He had my kidney, he had a fresh chance. I thought we would patch through whatever came after. Then one night at the hospital, a nurse's hushed laugh carried down the corridor, and I heard his voice, too close, too intimate. I should have known the second I heard him laugh the way he used to with me. But I had faith baked into my bones. Faith is a dangerous thing when you're holding someone else's life inside you. And then I walked into the recovery wing and saw them. They were sitting on his hospital bed, knees touching, his hand brushing her wrist like it was the most natural thing in the world. Kayla. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew that look, the half-tilt of her head, the smirk that said I'm not supposed to, but I will anyway. I stood there for a second, silent, numb. The air smelled like disinfectant and betrayal. He saw me before she did, and for a flash I swear there was guilt in his face. Then it vanished. He smiled like I was just another visitor, said, "Hey, babe," like everything was fine. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I just turned around and left. The next few days were a blur of pain meds, paperwork, and silence. He texted once, "You're overreacting. She's just someone to talk to." Someone to talk to while I was still healing from the surgery that gave him the right to breathe easy again. I tried to reason with him, tried to remind him what we'd gone through, but every word I said made him colder. He'd already rewritten the story in his head. He was grateful, but needed to figure himself out. Then the stories started trickling in from mutual friends. They'd seen him out, first at bars, then at some rooftop party with Kayla. The same Kayla from the hospital. She had started visiting him during rehab, keeping him company. I guess my kidney came with an emotional warranty she was eager to claim. I didn't even know how to process it. Every time I looked at the surgical scar under my ribs, it throbbed like a reminder of how stupid I'd been. My own body turned into proof of his betrayal. The final straw came at a friend's barbecue about 2 months later. I hadn't planned on seeing him, but Portland's small, and the universe clearly wanted me to witness my own humiliation. He showed up with her. They laughed, they shared food, and when someone made a joke about him being a new man, he actually said it. Yeah, new kidney, new life. Everyone laughed, everyone except me. I felt my stomach twist. Kayla saw me standing near the grill, watching, and she gave me this little smirk, like she knew exactly who I was. Later, when I passed her in the kitchen, she leaned in and whispered, "You're too kind. Some people just don't know when to stop giving." Then she laughed and added, "Guess that's why he calls you the donor girl." The donor girl. That nickname spread faster than I could stop it. Even some of our mutuals thought it was funny, like it was my fault for loving him too much. That night, I went home, opened my laptop, and found the folder with every hospital bill, every lab test, every email confirming the transplant. I played the voicemail he left before the surgery, the one where he sobbed, begging me to save him, promising I was his forever. I listened to it on repeat until my chest felt like fire. And right then, I realized something. If he thought new life meant freedom from consequences, then I'd make sure that new life ended the way his old one nearly did. But the way I'd do it wouldn't be through screaming or begging. It would start with his words. His exact words. I went digging because people who break you usually leave a trail. I started small, reading their public posts, watching their interactions at parties until small felt stupid. I needed proof, not gossip. So I asked a favor from someone who owed me. Jonna, a nurse I'd met in the pre-op ward who'd always been quietly kind. She hated Mark the way you hate someone who ruins good people. Jonna didn't ask why. She told me to bring my ID and meet her at the hospital that afternoon. I felt like a criminal sneaking through fluorescent halls, but the anger made me light. She led me to a staff station and slid a folder across the counter like we were playing spy games. Medical forms, internal memos, logged messages, all with Mark's name stamped across them. I learned 2 things in the next hour that rewired me. First, Mark hadn't just been careless or weak. He'd manufactured urgency. There were notes in his chart from 6 months earlier where a concierge nephrology clinic, a clinic he'd never mentioned, had marked his condition as stable, manageable. Later entries, right before my operation, had been amended by someone with nurse-level access. The language shifted toward rapid decline and expedited transplant recommended. Those edits weren't signatures I recognized. Jana's face went pale when she showed me timestamps and IP logs. The changes had been made from a workstation in the recovery ward. Second, Kayla wasn't a patient. She was clinic staff. She had a badge photo in the folder, a smiling young woman listed as patient liaison/volunteer coordinator. Her LinkedIn said medical volunteer, but the hospital directory showed an active employee ID. There were text logs, 2 short, frantic messages between Kayla and Mark the week before my surgery. Not flirty small talk, plans. Be there when she wakes, one message read. I'll distract the family, another. One line made me freeze. I'll make sure the notes say it's urgent. Donor more likely if it's urgent. I had always been careful about not imagining things. I'd believed in the person I loved until proof undercut the myth. Here it was. He'd leaned on a hospital employee. A woman who laughed and called me the donor girl later to push the paperwork, to change the tone, to make my consent look like the only humane option. The voicemail I kept replaying in the dark suddenly sounded different. The notes in the file said he'd been counseled about donor coercion twice, with a line in the margin that jumped off the page. Patient and donor relationship flagged for potential undue influence. The social worker had circled something and written a note. Monitor interactions, donor expresses possible pressure to consent. Why hadn't anyone stopped it? Why hadn't Jana told me? Because Jana had been afraid. The clinic ran on favors and quiet deals. People who asked questions quickly found themselves transferred or written up. Jana's hands shook when she showed me an email that suggested Kayla had been recommended for a promotion not long after my surgery. The implication was so ugly it tasted metallic, reward for the job being done. When I left the hospital that afternoon, I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like someone who'd been set up and then thanked with a nickname. The damage wasn't just betrayal, it was organized. They'd engineered my compassion into a transaction, then treated the transaction like a purchase, something you exchange and can't complain about. I sat in my car and let the heat drain out of me. The voicemail, his voice begging, the surgical scars, the nights of dread and care, they now looked like props in a con. The same hands that soothed me while I prepped my donation were the hands that typed the edits to make me consent without seeing the full truth. Kayla's later mocking about me being too kind. That was gloating, not victory. I should have gone to the police. I should have sued the hospital. But lawsuits are slow, evidence gets buried, and I didn't want a courtroom where he could rehearse grief and cry in front of strangers. I wanted him to feel the immediate collapse of everything he'd assumed he could buy with my organ. So I opened my phone, drafted an email, and then started forwarding copies of the medical receipts and the edits to people he couldn't charm away. I uploaded the voicemail, his begging voice, to a place he'd never be able to ignore. I didn't press send yet. There was more to do. I had to make sure the aftermath would hurt where it counted. Because if they thought they could turn compassion into a currency, I was about to bankrupt them. I didn't plan for fireworks. I planned for collapse, not loud, surgical, precise. The same way they'd weaponized my kindness, I would weaponize evidence and context until the life they'd built on my donation unraveled quietly and completely. First, I cleaned my head. Revenge that comes from rage is sloppy. Revenge that comes from a spreadsheet is lethal. I made a list. Names, roles, leverage. Who at the hospital could be embarrassed publicly, who could be deposed, who had a child in college, who had a Patreon that depended on a squeaky clean reputation. I wrote down every friend who owed me favors, every nurse who'd given me an extra Tylenol in the night, and Jana's name in bold. Next, I made the receipts speak. I scanned everything. Consent forms, the altered notes, the timestamps, Kayla's staff badge, the texts that read like a script. I timestamped the voicemail and clipped the heartbreaking part, his begging, the promise. And I ripped the context out of his crocodile tears by attaching the edited hospital logs right next to it. I wanted the world to see the before and after of their story. Desperate patient turned smooth operator, and a volunteer who'd played the gatekeeper. I set up accounts under names that looked ordinary. Not fake in the sloppy way, but convincing. Concerned citizen, hospital watch, little inboxes that would never be traced back to me. I uploaded the files onto a couple of public paste sites and a private cloud for backup, then created a short dossier and a one-page summary that made the narrative undeniable at a glance. Timeline, edits, texts, voicemail, no editorializing. Facts first. The goal was a simple, brutal truth. He'd orchestrated urgency and used an insider to help. Then I tested the reach. I messaged a journalist I'd met once at a charity dinner, a woman who hated malpractice stories and loved a narrative with teeth. I didn't spill the whole file. I sent the summary and one smoking screenshot. Kayla's message, "I'll make sure the notes say it's urgent." She replied in an hour. She wanted more. Good sign. I also curated the smaller, social hits. I printed out anonymized copies of the receipts to hand to people who would care in different ways. Mark's employer, the landlord who'd once threatened us with eviction, but treated Mark like family, and a few mutual friends who'd been casually cruel. I staged the delivery so that they would recognize the names and the context, but not assume I was the sender. Let gossip become inevitable. Let the social scaffolding supporting him rot first. There was risk, high risk. If I misstepped, if I overreached, I would look like an ex with a grudge and a folder of lies. So I carved safeguards. Encrypted backups, burner phones, a friend to pose as a whistleblower if the journalist called to verify. I rehearsed my story so I could sound calm under crossfire. "I'm the donor." I found edits. "I think there was coercion." Say it like you're filing taxes, flat, boring, unshakable. Emotion makes you look unstable. Facts make you look credible. But the part that scared me most wasn't the public humiliation I planned for Mark. It was Kayla. She'd been smug, cruel. She'd mocked me for being too kind. If she was a hospital employee, she would have a supervisor, maybe a history. If she didn't, she was just a user with a badge. Either way, she deserved exposure. I wanted her name in the same headline as his desperation. I started setting traps. I joined a local parents' Facebook group where I knew her mother lurked. I made a fake profile as a concerned neighbor and dropped the dossier into the group's inbox, knowing one forwarded message from an outraged parent would ricochet. I scheduled emails to go to Mark's boss at 9 a.m. on Monday, timed tweets to hit during lunch, and gave the journalist a deadline. Publish or we go public with all the files. The journalist smelled a diet of drama and wanted exclusivity. I used that. As the little machines I'd built started to tick, I felt something I hadn't in months: control. Not relief, not joy, though bitterness tasted like new energy. I was no longer the donor. I was the author of the story their lives would have to explain. Then, 2 nights before the big drop, Jonna called me from a blocked number. Her voice was raw and urgent. "There's something else," she said. "I found a code. Look at the lab log on the 14th. It's not just edits, there's a transfer." I sat down. My mouth went dry. "Transfer of what?" I asked. She breathed in and said, "Money, offshore. Same account Kayla's name is tied to." I stared at the phone and felt the floor tilt. If Jonna was right, this wasn't just emotional theft. This was criminal. And if it was criminal, the way to finish them wouldn't just be humiliation. It would be permanent. I didn't hang up. I didn't move. The plan had just become a prosecution. When Jonna told me about the offshore transfer, I felt like the ground under me made a new, jagged sound. I'd come armed to expose one betrayal. What she found next made it look like I'd only seen the tip of an iceberg. She kept digging, quietly, the way someone with hospital access learns to move, and she sent me a single PDF at midnight. I opened it with shaking hands and read until dawn. It wasn't just one suspicious transfer. It was a pattern spread across years, across different names, different wards, different donors. At first I thought it was a mistake, but the files lined up like a puzzle with the picture already printed. Patient IDs that all had a single overlapping field. Mark's name as an emergency contact, often listed in handwriting on consent forms that looked suspiciously like his. Kayla, or someone with her access level, appeared in the staff notes for many of the entries. The edits, those same edits we'd found in my chart, the ones that made stable into urgent, showed up again and again. Someone in the recovery ward had been pushing language, and someone else was nudging the donors toward consent, while the actual patients were kept fragile and grateful. One of the donor names was from Boise. Another was a young man from Eugene. The same phrase kept appearing in the clerk's notes. Donor seems very willing, encouraged to proceed. Encouraged by whom? The timeline for several of these cases also stunned me. Donor screening looms large and invasive. But in each of these files, the decision was rushed, consent forms signed within days of a supposedly new diagnosis. Then I hit the real sickening part. There was a ledger, an internal spreadsheet hidden in a folder that Jana wasn't supposed to have. It showed payments, reimbursements, and line items labeled like accounting euphemisms. Liaison stipend, expedite fee, patient care goodwill. Amounts were routed to accounts that, when cross-checked, traced back to a shell company registered under a relative's name. From there, the money moved offshore. One account had a note: compensation for care during donor process, MK. MK, Mark's initials. My head spun. This wasn't a one-off affair of a weak man who traded fidelity for convenience. This was a method, an exploiter with accomplices who knew where to push and how hard. He'd built a system inside a place meant to save lives. He'd found the people who could make a clinical urgency look legitimate, and then used them like looters using a storm. I started connecting the social dots. The donors' social profiles, people who described themselves as kind, civic-minded, sometimes lonely, had pictures of them volunteering, of them with dog rescue t-shirts. People who gave. People like me. The deeper betrayal wasn't only that he'd cheated on me or that Kayla had mocked me. It was that he'd chosen a methodical predation, spotting the generous and the vulnerable, leaning on hospital staff to cut corners, turning compassion into a currency he could spend on a new apartment, new clothes, new nights out where his new life looked like success instead of theft. I felt fever-hot and ice-cold at the same time. Rage was rational now. It had a ledger and receipts. But underneath that, something uglier bubbled, a kind of horror at how bright and ordinary his charm had been. Men like him aren't flashy crooks. They're the ones who know how to make you believe you're helping a person, not financing a con. When I called Jana, her voice was tight. "There's more," she said. "I found emails between Kayla and an external recruitment agency. They coordinate volunteers for the clinic pipeline," was the exact word. "They mention incentive structures for high-yield donors. This is bigger than the ward. Bigger. Criminal, maybe. Organized." On the other end of the line, Jana warned me not to touch anything else without counsel. "If you leak this wrong, they'll bury it," she said. "If you go loud, they'll close ranks." That was the other shard slicing me: fear. This wasn't just about shaming a cheater. This could pull people into investigations, maybe jail. People could lose licenses, careers, livelihoods. Justice might mean wrecking other lives in different ways. But the ledger didn't soften the cruelty. If anything, it made his voice in my voicemail sound filthier. No longer a desperate plea, but the practiced tremor of a man who knew exactly what to say to bend someone. I sat in my car behind a Starbucks at 3 a.m., the city empty and all my plans suddenly feeling inadequate. "Bigger," I whispered to myself. I thought about the donors' faces in the files, about how naive hope had been turned into a revenue stream. I thought about Kayla's laugh, and the way Mark had called me, the donor girl, like he was describing a purchase he'd made. The choice narrowed, sharp and unforgiving. Expose them publicly and risk getting trapped in a legal morass that could bury the truth, or craft a takedown so undeniable that nobody could spin it away. I opened my notes app and typed one sentence, the plan reforming into something colder and larger. They had built a system. I was going to pull the keystone out. I always thought there was some tragic thing inside him, a sickness that made him take the easy way. I wanted a soft answer, something I could pity and fold into a story where I still mattered. The truth was worse and quieter. He did it because he could, because he liked the power of conversion. When Jana handed me the ledger, I read it again and again until the numbers blurred. It wasn't about bills or a desperate need. The money flows were consistent, modest per donor but steady, and they routed through a chain that ended at a company name mark used in old emails for contract work. He'd built a small economy around other people's generosity. My chest went cold because I finally understood the shape of his appetite. He didn't need my kidney to survive. He needed it as currency. Not literal currency, the way he used people was more elegant than that. He used gratitude, obligation, and the social myth of saving someone to make vendors cut him deals, to get landlords to nod, to make former girlfriends forgive him when he rearranged their lives. A man who can engineer a moral debt can turn kindness into leverage, and that leverage buys better clothes, better nights, better stories for parties. He'd learned to sell being saved. There was a folder in his online drives labeled Assets. In plain text, not inked in code or joke, lists of names, small notes beside them: donor, high social value, good for future favors, family likely to support. My name had next to it. Emotional leverage, possible long-term loan. The language was clinical, like a banker's, but aimed at people. He cataloged affection and charity like inventory. And the cruelest part, the thing that made me physically sick, was that he liked the theater of it. He told me once, months before the transplant, that people show you who they are when they need something. He wasn't saying it as a lament. He was saying it as a business plan. He had refined how to spot the types who would swing toward help. Volunteers, dog rescuers, brownie bakers, people who believed in moral accounting. He trained Kayla and others to be friendly, to steer conversations, to make urgency feel urgent. He made hospitals a marketplace and kindness the product. Why mock me later in front of friends? Because he wanted to strip me of dignity after he'd taken my organ. Mocking turned me into a story he could tell. Donor Girl reduced me from person to transaction in his ledger. It made other people laugh and made him feel better about what he'd done. That's the worst thing about sociopaths. They don't just hurt you. They polish the wound into a spectacle and invite others to admire the cut. He'd also learned how to manipulate guilt to his advantage. He used the voicemail, the crying, the promises like receipts. When people called him cruel, he played the tape and watched them melt. He begged me, he'd say, and everyone would step back, uncomfortable, because saving someone is supposed to feel noble and saving someone is supposed to create debt. He weaponized the idea of being saved. The ledger proved it wasn't random. Mark had been steadily turning human kindness into social capital for years. He'd practiced disgrace as a craft. Kayla wasn't an innocent helper who fell in love in a hospital bed. She was part of a machine that rewarded the people who made the deals happen. They'd trained the clinic to move faster, to make consent easier, to nudge the lonely into saying yes. Hearing the ledger's truth rewired my anger into something harder. It wasn't about a broken heart anymore. It was about a person who'd used a place that promises care as if it were a strip mall, cashing out on compassion. There was no tragic illness to mourn. There was only calculation and ease. That's when I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like an avenger. Not righteous, not healed, just precise. I had the receipts and the ledger and the proof that this was a pattern. I knew the shape of his map. I knew how he had traveled it. And I knew, with a coldness I hadn't expected, what would have to burn for the ledger to mean anything at all. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted inevitability, the slow arithmetic of consequences that leaves no room for spin. The plan I'd built in quiet turned into a single, public collapse, and it worked the way a well-placed lever works. Small push, everything gives. I let the journalist have the exclusive. She ran the piece on a Thursday morning, timeline, screenshots, voicemail, ledger excerpts, and Jana's corroboration. The headline was clinical and mean and perfect. Hospital ring used kindness as currency. Internal files expose transplant scheme. I watched the shares climb with a tired kind of vigilance. Comments, outraged threads, a local TV station sniffing for on-camera indignation. Mark's phone went silent for a minute and then rang like a bell that could not stop. People I hadn't spoken to in years texted me a string of shocked emojis and then apologies. Some were real. Some were people repositioning themselves on a safer moral bank. Kayla's mother, the woman who'd sent me a passive-aggressive birthday card once, messaged me in a panic before anyone else called her. I sent her a copy of the receipts and a note. You can ask her why she called me donor girl at a party. She didn't reply. Within 48 hours, the hospital issued a statement. We are cooperating with investigators. They did that because lawyers told them to, and because insurance doesn't like surprise bankruptcies. Kayla was put on administrative leave. Mark's boss called HR and then called me, awkwardly, as if sympathy could erase ledger entries. HR opened a file. The state medical board started asking for records. Jana, the nurse who'd helped me, was offered witness protection in a sense, anonymous testimony, a lawyer's number. I watched them all start to untangle, the way a sweater comes apart at a tug. I felt bad, sometimes, in the way you feel bad because a nail you hit bent someone's ego instead of their skull. Lives were complicated, consequences rippled. But then I thought of the donors in the files, the lonely, the kind, the people who'd been nudged into giving a piece of themselves for someone who turned their charity into profit. I thought of how I'd woken up and found my body was proof on a ledger. I thought of the way he'd mocked me, the way she'd called me a nickname meant to erase me. They wanted to make me small, so I made their method visible. The legal stuff moved like molasses. Lawsuits were filed. There were press conferences with muffled remorse. Mark's mother sat on TV and cried in that practiced way people do when cameras are on. I didn't watch the trial. I watched the ledger move from private to public and felt the word, accountability, click into place like a safety. The revenge I wanted, the one that left me breathing easier at night, wasn't him in a cell or a headline that killed him. It was the reclamation of my story. I stopped being the donor girl in other people's mouths. Friends who stayed learned the full version. People who voted with their silence found their feeds full of receipts. The name that once shrank me became the title of the article the journalist tucked in her lead about corporate exploitation. When it was finally done, when the investigators closed their initial findings, and the hospital announced personnel changes and a review board, I went back to the river where we'd first met. It was raining the same odd Portland rain, soft and steady. I folded my scarf into my hands and thought about how I'd given away a part of me and then taken back something harder. My narrative. He did what he did because he could. I did what I did because I had to. There is no heroic cadence to my actions. There is only a ledger balanced at last. I kept one thing private. The voicemail he left, the one I'd uploaded and used like an exhibit. I never deleted it, because weapons become trophies if you keep them. I played it once, alone, late, to remind myself of how far I'd come. His voice broke the same way it always had, desperate, slick with promise. I listened and felt nothing explosive, just a hollow where anger used to live. Then I tossed the phone into a drawer, shut it, and walked home. The city smelled like wet asphalt and possibility. I was tired, still sore, scar-sharp beneath my ribs. But I felt something I hadn't in a long time, the quiet, boring kind of closure that paperwork and truth can give. I didn't need to be vengeful forever. I needed to be thorough. And thorough, in the end, was enough. Kicker. Turns out the best medicine for being too kind is a spreadsheet and a bad faith exposure. And I got both.